Last time we had a look at Yasuo and his story that had some scary hints towards Yone. But when it comes to Yasuo, his most famous opponent is still Riven. So it wasn't a surprise to see that Riven got a story of her own too. But what's so cool about this one is that this new story is happening while the big Sisterhood of War series is going on. So before we jump into the second part of that massive lore event, which was also released on top of that, because Riven is important there, we should have a look at Riven's side of the story first. So without further ado, here's the story called Seams and Scars. The story begins with Muramat asking the question, "How come you to Ionia, friend?" Muramat was an Ionian traveler who had never felt uncomfortable sharing her campfire with other travelers along the road to the markets. But now, for the first time, she was sitting across the flames with a Noxian, one with an enormous weapon strapped across her back. Of course, we are talking about Riven. Riven glanced at what the story called her father, before she swallowed a mouthful of charred peppers and rice. Then she looked down at her plate. She replied that she was born in Noxus, but she had been here since the war began, and she did not plan to return. As she spoke, she still had her Noxian accent, but her Ionian tonality was nearly flawless. Riven's quote-unquote father, Ashakonte, smiled and placed a hand on her shoulder, before saying, "This is her home now." Of course, we know Ashakonte from the other big story Riven has, The Confessions of a Broken Blade. There, Riven started a new life in an Ionian village. The locals knew that she was a Noxian, but since Riven was working hard and she wanted to atone for her service in the war, they forgave her, even after learning that Riven killed Yasuo's master on accident. And so, Asha and Chava Conte, two Ionian elders, adopted Riven as their own daughter. Anyway, back to the story. Muramat had invited Asha to make camp with her before she had spotted the Noxian asleep in the back of his cart. But since Asha introduced Riven as his daughter in a defensive tone, Muramat had nothing to say against the strange old man's declaration. Although that didn't make her any less suspicious of Riven. And so, as Muramat poured herself a cup of tea, she continued their conversation. "You have not answered my question. What brought you to the shores, Riven?" Riven tightly gripped her plate, tension rippling through her shoulders. As she answered, "I fought in the war." It was a simple statement, and yet to those who listened, it was interesting to hear regret from a Noxian. And so Muramat asked further, "Why would anyone stay in a place where they and their people have caused so much pain, so much destruction?" There was a crack, as the plate Riven was holding broke in half under the pressure of her grip, her charred peppers and rice falling on the ground. Then Riven gasped, and she immediately bowed down, apologizing and saying that she would pay for the plate and leave. She didn't mean to intrude. Before Riven could finish that sentence, she noticed that Muramat wasn't listening. Instead, she held the shards of the broken plate close to her ears, humming softly. Slowly, she adjusted her pitch, calling to the spirit within the clay. The back of her skull tingled when she hit the right tone, as the spirit reverberated with her hum. Holding the note, Muramat lifted her Mender's necklace and flicked its chimes until she found the one that joined her and the spirit in singing. She stared at the chime in the firelight. Each one had been inscribed with a symbol that identified how to mend a resonant spirit. And the chime that hummed now had the symbol of the smoke, which looked like a single line with a curve that became more pronounced toward the end. And so Muramat lifted the shards of the plate above the fire to bathe them in the smoke. It took only moments before they knitted back together, with only a few coal-colored seams and ridges to show that the plate had ever been broken. Muramat then explained that she was a mender, and so there was no reason to replace things. Riven's eyes were wide open. As she ran her fingers down the thick black seam, she asked, "How does it work?" And Muramat explained that everything has a spirit, and every spirit wants to be whole. So she is asking them what they need to mend, and then she gives it to them. Riven sighed as she pointed out that it still leaves scars. But Muramat added that scars were a sign of healing. That plate would never be seamless again, but it was whole, and it was strong. She would even say it was more beautiful like this. Riven considered the plate in silence, before finally saying, "I am here because I have caused so much pain and so much destruction. I stay to atone." Muramat nodded somberly. Clearly, Riven's scars, though invisible, ran deep. Perhaps this Noxian was different from the others. But then Muramad's eyes fell onto the hilt of Riven's massive weapon. A tool for cutting, not mending. And she asked herself, how different can she really be? The story then cuts to the moment Muramad woke up in the middle of the night. She was woken up by a loud thump against the side of her caravan. It was bandits. Riven had insisted on keeping watch through the night. Muramad remembered this as she grabbed the heaviest kettle. But thankfully she was experienced in dealing with robbers, and she could always hold her own in a fight. When she opened the door, however, she saw that Riven would not need her help after all. One of the intruders was laying on the ground in front of the caravan. By the fire stood Riven, surrounded by 3 other hulking bandits. She held the enormous hilt, and Muramad was surprised to see only a broken blade attached to the end. Yet the weapon was still formidable. It seemed to pulse in Riven's hands as she waited for the others to advance. Muramad's stomach turned to see that blade, not relishing the sight of a Noxian spilling more Ionian blood. But still, she watched. The bandits rushed at Riven, shouting, but she took a single step forward and pushed them back with a burst of energy from her blade. They dropped their weapons, and they scrambled to find them in the darkness. Riven could have cut them all down, Muramad realized, but she didn't. Instead, she raised her sword, which began to glow an eerie green. The magic from the weapon blasted outward and repelled one of the bandits as soon as it touched him. He fell on the ground in a daze. By this point, the others were on their feet with their weapons ready. Riven brought her arms back, and glowing pieces of metal flew toward Riven from the cart. The shards formed around the blade, making it look almost whole, though there were still gaps between the pieces. The bandits charged forward again, or so they tried, because Riven whipped the blade in front of her and blew them back against the caravan with a gust of wind, knocking them all unconscious. It was a bloodiless victory. Muramad stepped gingerly over the defeated bandits, and she asked Riven, "What will you do with them?" Riven shrugged, letting the shards of her sword drop to the ground. "I'll just tie them to a tree until morning." Muramad stared at the remnant of the blade. It didn't seem as threatening anymore, now that she had seen how Riven wielded it. She then asked, "Could I see your weapon?" Riven frowned and took a step back. Why? Muramad calmed her down by saying that she didn't need to hand it to her. She could just hold it up. So warily, Riven raised the blade, and Muramad closed her eyes and hummed. Alarmed, Riven asked, "What are you doing?" But that's when Muramad found just the right pitch. Muramad could feel a pair of eyes searching. 3 hunters. Hearts filled with hate. Thoughts of revenge. Burning. Everything was burning. Muramad didn't realize that she had fallen, until she felt Riven shake her to see if she was alright. Muramad then whispered with a dry throat that someone was searching for the blade. Someone was searching for Riven. Upon hearing this, Riven's face turned pale, but her eyes revealed nothing. In a low whisper she asked, "What did you do?" Muramad replied that she was wrong to question her, and she offered to mend her sword as an apology. But Riven answered no, in a tone that took Muramad by surprise. She then added, "If you truly want to thank me, you will never fix this blade. The one thing I want you to fix, you can't. But thank you for the offer." Riven then sighed, exhausted, and she collected up the shards of the sword. "You should go back to sleep if you want to get to the marketplace early tomorrow." Muramad nodded and slowly made her way to the caravan. When she looked back, Riven was at the fire, sitting and watching the night. Not for the first time, Muramad wished she knew how to mend people. And that is the new story of Riven! Obviously there were some references to the Sisterhood of War. I guess this is spoilers for the first part, in case you haven't read the story yet, or watched our video on it. But here, Muramad told Riven that Errol, which is the one with the hounds, Merit, which is the arrogant one with the lizard bird mount, and Tenef, which is the pit fighter, are the 3 hunters that are after Riven. However, Muramad did not mention the main character of the story, Arath, or the Runesmith, both of whom are part of the squad that is hunting Riven down. But of course this could be explained by Muramad first saying that someone is looking for the blade, and then talking about the 3 hunters. So maybe she meant that there are 3 hunters going after Riven, and 1 person going after the sword. Because remember, at the very beginning of the Sisterhood of War story, Typhalangi, the runesmith, was sent out, perhaps by the Veiled Lady, to look for something irreplaceable, which might be the blade, not Riven. Also, Muhammad saw a searching pair of eyes, which I do believe is the Veiled Lady. Either way, this still leaves Erath as an unimportant character, because Muhammad did not mention him at all. All we know is that everything will burn, but what that might be, we are not sure yet. Perhaps this might be explained in the second part of the Sisterhood of War story, because to be honest, I haven't read it yet. Interestingly enough, that still leaves us with the question, will the two new champions be linked to this? Some people mention that the two new champions could be the two Ionian gods from the Perennial story, the Gatekeeper and the Collector, which would be cool. But unfortunately, that would leave Riven entirely out of this. Which is a shame, because the Sisterhood of War series is turning into something really good. On the other side, even if the two new champions end up having nothing to do with this at all, we will still have to admit that it was really smart from Riot to use this event as a tool to get Riven back to Noxus. They didn't need to do this, and they could have just focused on the new stories for the two new champions. But this way, just as Sylas pushed Demacia forward by a light year, Riven seems to be doing the same for both Noxus and Ionia. On top of that, I am just glad that Riot is making the Awakened cinematic canon. Which reminds me that yes, this means that Sion will be released onto the Ionian battlefield. But on the same topic, despite the appearance of the other popular character, even with all the theories going mad, I can't say I saw Yone in the cinematic, which still gives me hope. However, I do remember that one of the guys working on the cinematic mentioned that nobody found an Easter egg they had put in the scene where Yasuo summoned the tornado. So people, get your magnifying glasses. If Yone's there, we need to find him. Natáčím. Tak mi to tady nechte, natáčím. Tak 30 minut asi. Děkuji. Přesně to.
Dobře, tady máš. To se mi kečupíkově neštěstí.
Tak já to dám do videjka.
Tak jo.